What's up guys, Kino Corner here. I've had a bit of a problem on my channel ever since I started it. I love talking about films that you might think are obscure or weird because, well, I like a lot of those movies. However, for a variety of very understandable reasons, YouTube doesn't favor videos on those kinds of films. You'll notice that I tend to piggyback lesser known films into videos about more popular movies. Like, for example, I had a small segment on the movie Angst during my video on Irreversible. During my Literally Me video, I put in a part about Buffalo 66. And afterwards, I had so many people telling me that they watched that film based off my recommendation and that they loved it. The fact that I can introduce people to new movies that become their favorite movies makes my job worth it. So I made a list of 10 cool films that I don't see discussed much on YouTube that I want to share with all of you. Maybe one of these movies will be one of your new favorite movies. Maybe not. Maybe this video will just help you to decide what to watch on a Friday night when you find yourself in that endlessly scrolling through different streaming services loop. So, without further ado, let's start with Underground. Underground. How do I even begin to describe this movie? Well, let me put all my cards on the table. I think it's an absurdist masterpiece that feels like peak Fellini in Yugoslavia. It's got this driving, kinetic energy fueled by what I assume is a semi-diegetic brass band that follows the main characters for the entirety of this 3-hour movie. A completely bizarre but also moving story pairs with the film's zany pacing. The two main characters of the film, Blackie and Marco, are Serbian thieves who join the Communist Party and end up fighting the Germans. Blackie is much more for the cause and dedicated to Tito than Marco, who really just wants to do whatever he can to make himself more money. But as what often happens, a woman comes between them. Marco is in love with Blackie's mistress, Natalia, but Natalia is also the mistress of a high-ranking German officer, Franz. Indeed, a lot of Blackie's hatred for the Germans stems from, I think, his jealousy. But Natalia doesn't like Blackie's brutish behavior and allows Marco to seduce her behind Blackie's back. And things work out for Marco, as Blackie injures himself in the line of duty. Marco brings Blackie to their underground bunker where they manufacture weapons, and seals him in there for 15 years, keeping Natalia all to himself. He convinces everyone underground that World War II is still going on, that the Germans are occupying Yugoslavia, and that Tito is ordering them to stay where they are and help with the war effort. In reality, they're making weapons for Marco, who is now an arms dealer to the Yugoslavian government. At the same time, a movie studio is shooting a movie celebrating the exploits of Blackie and Marco during the war, all while Blackie itches to leave the bunker and finish this war, once and for all. You can probably guess how this leads to a little bit of confusion. It's a film that's an absurdist romp, a fairy tale, and a history of Yugoslavia from World War II to the Balkan Wars. The set design is impeccable, with striking and moody cinematography to boot. You can take almost any still from this film and frame it. The banger of a soundtrack keeps the energy going and ensures that the film never once becomes boring. It's 3 hours long, but it feels half that length. And for a movie with as many characters as it has, they all manage to stand out. They're all given quirks that make them immediately recognizable, like Bada's glasses that make his eyes look huge, Ivan's speech impediment, or Jovan's wonder at everything outside of the cellar. Oh, and speaking of Jovan, he might look familiar to you. You want to know why? The actor that portrays him, excuse me for butchering this pronunciation, is Srđan Todorović. He was the lead actor in a little movie you might have heard of, a Serbian film. Underground balances batshit crazy shenanigans and imagery with a sobering look at the cycles of violence that plagued Yugoslavia, though it does end on an optimistic note. It's a film about how false realities can be constructed by those in power, and how living under communism was akin to living in a cellar in a state of constant war. It also touches on how history is written, and how we construct our stories, and thus reconstruct our pasts for our own betterment. This film honestly deserves its own video, but for the time being, I'll just tell you that you have to see it. When people think of Dennis Hopper, movies like Easy Rider, Blue Velvet, Speed, or Apocalypse Now often come to mind. But in the early 70s, Hopper directed and starred in a film so weird and trippy that it gained a kind of cult status in some cinephile circles. That movie was The Last Movie, a film about a Hollywood stuntman in Peru working on a Western. Let me try to tell you the story in a sensical way. He works on the Western, but once the production ends, the locals recreate the movie production with makeshift film equipment. They do all this as a kind of ritual, and they name Hopper's character El Muerto, since he was the guy that constantly, quote-unquote, died in the movie. Meanwhile, Hopper tries to start a new life with a Peruvian girlfriend. Their relationship has ups and downs like any, and Hopper looks for the next big job since he's no longer working on a film. He and his friend hear of a possible gold mine, and they raise money to excavate it from other Americans, who do sexually humiliate Hopper. There's also a weird scene with a sex show. So he's looking for gold, and the locals want to sacrifice him. All the while, we're not quite sure what's real and what's not, and the whole movie is edited in just a super trippy way. It's told non-chronologically. It's got harsh cuts. It goes from peaceful scenes to chaos. It's like Hopper never wants you to be comfortable watching the movie, or Hopper was just super high when making it. For the record, he was super high when making it. Watching this movie is an absolute trip. I love it, but I know that this one will be very polarizing. It's one of those movies I'll show to friends who come to my house as a sort of joke, because the only response I've ever gotten was, "What the fuck did I just watch?" Was this film an expression of Hopper's ego? Maybe. Was this film inspired by his drug use? Absolutely. Is this film great? I'll leave that up to you. The Man Who Stole the Sun might be the most obscure film on the list. As of right now, the only way to watch it is on the Internet Archive or if you buy a Japanese DVD. I want to thank my subscriber Nutticus for lending me his DVD for the video. It's actually a great quality DVD, but I hope that a Blu-ray for other regions gets made because it's a fun movie that should be seen by more people. This film is wacky. It's about a middle or high school science teacher who wants to build his very own atomic bomb. So the first part of the movie is about him obsessing over building this weapon and teaching his board class about the process. The hardest part of the process is stealing the plutonium, but he gets it done. There's a long sequence showing the protagonist, Makoto Kido, building the bomb. The sequence was initially so detailed and accurate that the Japanese government instructed the filmmakers to cut it down. It's a cool montage to watch, but the movie really starts to get going once the bomb is done. Because once Kido finishes making the bomb, or in this case 2 bombs, the question posed to us and to Kido is, what now? The answer Kido gives is, I don't know. He dresses up as a pregnant woman to plant one of the bombs in a woman's restroom before informing the police that it's there. That's just to show them that he means business. Next, he uses the other bomb as leverage to make insane demands to the Japanese government, like make the TV channel show the final innings of the baseball games and bring the Rolling Stones to Tokyo for a concert. It results in a cat and mouse chase between Kido and Inspector Yamashita, a detective who saved Kido's life at the beginning of the film. Along the way, there are stings, car chases, shootouts, a romance, twists, and turns. It's got it all, even if maybe it is a bit too long. The film is both absurd and silly, but very serious undercurrents flow under this escapist story. The film tackles the growing social isolation and alienation in Japan, as well as fears and trauma stemming from the Second World War. Weirdly enough, the director, Kazuhiko Hasegawa, co-wrote the film with Leonard Schrader, Paul Schrader's brother. I guess both brothers were weebs and fans of writing Sigma characters. This film should, by all means, be seen as a cult classic of Japanese cinema. It starred one of Japan's rock stars of the time, Kenshi Sawada, and had him facing off against another superstar, Bunta Sugawara. However, it's fallen into obscurity for one reason or another. Let's change that. It may not be a perfect film, but it doesn't deserve this fate. Oh, and before I forget, a couple years ago, I had a short-lived podcast with Oki's Weird Stories called Kino Cast. Our first episode was us discussing this film, so if you want to hear more about what we thought of it, I'll leave a link in the description. Deep Cover is a pretty underrated undercover cop movie from the early 90s. Lawrence Fishburne, who you probably know from The Matrix, plays as Russell Stevens, a cop assigned to go undercover in the LA drug scene to take down the major drug distributors. Before this assignment, he was straight edge. No drugs, no alcohol, no nothing. His father was a criminal and a junkie. Russell doesn't want to be anything like him, but for the sake of the job, he has to embrace his shadow. Russell works his way up the criminal hierarchy, doing anything and everything to get ahead. Slowly but surely, the things he has to do for his work chip away at his soul, and he has to ask himself this question: is he a cop playing a criminal, or a criminal playing a cop?
I'm a cop pretending to be a drug dealer. I ain't nothing but a drug dealer pretending to be a cop.
I've talked about Fishburne as the conflicted undercover cop, but the other major standout is Jeff Goldblum's turn as David Jason. He plays as a Jewish lawyer who helps run the drug trade and fetishizes black people and their culture. He often comes across as cringy and try-hard and kinda racist, but Goldblum's delivery is what you'd expect from him. He's great in pretty much everything he's in.
Man, I like balling black chicks so much. I don't know, maybe you feel like you're fucking a slave. What do you mean, like a bondage thing?
No, like a racist thing.
His dynamic with Stevens is interesting. He's a lawyer and a drug dealer, while Stevens is a cop and a drug dealer. Both characters straddle both sides of the law, but where do their true allegiances lie? On the other hand, Detective Taft acts as a counterbalance to Stevens. He's a policeman and a pastor. He's a man to remind Stevens that he needs to go down the right path, that being the path of righteousness and lawfulness. The other characters, especially Barbosa, give menacing performances that elevate the tension of the film. The film explores the drug epidemic of the 80s and 90s, the government's role in it, government corruption, and identity, especially black identity, all in a hard-boiled LA neo-noir. It's one of those movies that's easily enjoyed, but it manages to stay with you for a while after you finish watching it. I Am Cuba, directed by Georgian filmmaker Mikhail Kalatozov. Is it communist propaganda? Definitely. Is it a great film? Definitely. This brings up an interesting question. Can a movie that's obviously propaganda be a work of art? Can one enjoy something that they fundamentally disagree with? I am by no means a communist, and with the help of historical hindsight, I know that the ideals purported in the movie weren't quite achieved in Cuba. That's what often happens. One bad regime was replaced by another bad regime. But I'm not here to get into Cold War politics. You might be a communist, you might not be. It doesn't matter. Can a piece of work that serves the interests of a state or a political party be something that can be universally appreciated as art and enjoyed? I think so. Often, the film people use as an example of this is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, but in reality, pretty much every country has its fair share of propaganda films, with quality varying quite wildly. In school in the West, we're shown the works of Sergei Eisenstein as examples of artistic propaganda. Let's face it, the Soviets made great propaganda, but we also have to acknowledge that many films we cherish as Westerners, or as Americans, also fall into this category. We just might not be as perceptive of it because the films align with our worldviews. Top Gun, Zero Dark 30, American Sniper, Argo, Casablanca, Rocky IV, a lot of war movies, and actually, one could make the argument that most, if not all, major Hollywood films are to some degree propagandistic. Does that mean that none of them are art? Does that mean that none of them are enjoyable? No. Look, I don't care about the fact that Top Gun is trying to get me to join the Navy. I will still have the volleyball scene on repeat in the background to all my parties. I should edit that out. So if the fact that the film espouses a radically different ideology than yours makes it so that you absolutely cannot watch the movie, then simply don't. However, if you are an intellectually and artistically curious person, then I would highly recommend this movie. Kalatozov's films are known for their fantastic and sweeping cinematography. I Am Cuba is no different. Kalatozov uses long tracking and handheld shots to transport us across sets that are sometimes dizzying, but always beautiful. The composition and texture of the images here are unmatched in most of cinema. You don't have to know what any of the characters are saying for the film to emotionally impact you. That's how strong the visual storytelling is in this movie. That's not to diminish the superb sound design and music in this film. All the technical elements come together to create an astounding cinematic experience. The movie is made up of 4 short stories, 2 before the revolution and 2 during the revolution. The film begins by showing the hedonism of the Americans as a group of slimy middle-aged men drink and dance in a nightclub. They order some girls to their table, and one girl, Betty, is both in love with the man and religious, but the Americans take advantage of her before forcibly buying her crucifix, showing how capitalism reduces religion to a mere transaction. The second story is about a large corporation destroying an old farmer's plot of land. The third story follows a student as he rallies his comrades to join the revolution, and the fourth story is about a farmer who initially doesn't want to fight for the cause, but certain tragic events give him a change of heart. It's hard to find a copy of this anywhere, but you can watch the film in full on Mosfilm's YouTube channel. If you're in North America though, you might need to use a VPN as I think it's region locked. Also, even though this copy of the film has English subtitles, it also has a Russian dub, which I don't mind, but I could see people finding annoying. It's like the studio, when asked dubs or subs, responded with, both.
Парень думает, что они растут на деревьях.
Hopefully, we can get a version of this movie soon that only has the original Spanish audio. Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. Elio Petri's Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion is a mystery movie unlike any other. It begins with a murder, like most murder mysteries, but the perpetrator of the murder is the head of the homicide division in Rome's police force. On the day of his promotion to the political division of the force, Dottore murders his lover. He cuts her throat mid-coitus and then cooks the crime scene. Not to cover his tracks, but to declare his guilt. He places clues like bloody footprints and fabric from his tie around her apartment for the detectives to find. Why? He wants to prove that he is indeed a citizen above suspicion. It's an exercise of his power, as only truly powerful men can get away with murder. But anyone who has read Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment understands that much of the punishment for a sin, like murder, comes from within. Dottore, excellently portrayed by Jean-Maria Volonté, you might know him from the Dollars trilogy, slowly loses his mind as the investigation is conducted. He oscillates between wanting them to know that he did it and wanting to cover up all the evidence. There are many more layers to this film. As acting head of the political division, Dottore uses his powers to spy on any and all dissidents in the area, with his main focus being a young communist man who lives in the same apartment as his deceased lover. The young man also witnessed Dottore leaving the scene of the crime, and so Dottore fears that he can ruin his career. The other layer involves the police not wanting to face facts. They find his fingerprints all over the crime scene, and so much of the evidence points to Dottore being the murderer, but they make up excuses and even coerce witnesses into bearing false testimonies. Then, there's a storyline of the romance between Dottore and his lover Augusta, which is told in flashbacks. She's a freewheeling lady obsessed with police and crime. As a couple, they recreate murder scenes, always with her as the victim. It adds a new element to the murder. Maybe this was also a result of a fetish gone too far. Overall, Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion is a biting satire of the police state and the nature of power. I know the way I've described it might make it sound like a super serious and dark film. I mean, it is very Kafka-esque and it doesn't shy away from looking into the abyss, but it does so in a pretty campy and fun way. You can't help but laugh at a lot of what you see in the film. The characters are all extremely Italian to the point where they feel like parody.
Annunzio.
You can bet that there's a lot of talking with hands, histrionics, and shouting in this movie. Adding to this, Ennio Morricone's soundtrack for this movie doesn't feel dark or brooding, but rather bouncy, goofy, and a bit mysterious. That's the strength of this movie. The comedy, camp, and absurdity heighten the very evils this film presents. You'll laugh, you'll feel suspense, and then you'll stare into the abyss. Petri knew that just a spoonful of sugar helps the black pill go down. The Tribe. The Tribe is a film about boarding students in Ukraine. Oh, they're also in a gang and engage in prostitution, theft, violence, and general antisocial behavior. And, am I missing anything? Oh yeah, it's all in Ukrainian Sign Language, with no subtitles. You might think that it would be impossible to know what's going on, but weirdly, you don't. It's kind of like watching a silent movie that lacks any intertitles. But trust me, it's not a hard movie to follow. I actually caught myself paying more attention to the film than I might pay to other movies, as in the absence of language, I had to study the expressions and body language of the characters to figure out what was going on. You have to be an active viewer, not a passive viewer, when watching this movie. The film, which runs for 2 hours and 11 minutes, is made up of only 34 shots. The whole film was shot on a 24mm lens, and I'm pretty sure all the shots are Steadicam shots. The director, Miroslav Slabashpitsky, keeps everything at a bit of a distance. It gives us the feeling that we're following these characters from a couple paces away. We can observe them, but we can't get too close. So what's it about? The director described the film as a kind of Western, which fits. Sergei, a teenage boy, moves into a boarding school for the deaf, only to find himself in the midst of a criminal organization. There's a kind of deaf mafia that runs the place. Even some of the teachers are in on it. He has to prove himself to the other boys, and he soon finds himself rising in the ranks of the gang. But the fissures and rifts start to show when he falls in love with one of the girls. Soon, friends become enemies, and the violence escalates. I do have to temper this recommendation with some caveats. For one, I guess it's slow. I didn't think it was slow, but I showed it to some friends and they thought it was super slow. I can understand their perspective, even if I disagree. Also, the movie is explicit in just about every way. It's graphic in its portrayal of violence and sex and explores the darkness of humanity without looking away. It's very disturbing. So if you can't handle movies that get that intense, I'd advise you to steer clear. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy it. You might recognize the director Pablo Larraín from his recent Oscar-nominated films Jackie and Spencer, but before he began making English-language movies about Western political figures, he was directing movies in his home country of Chile. No, Lorraine's 2012 film about the 1988 referendum concerning whether or not Augusto Pinochet would stay in power was the movie that put Lorraine on the map for me. The first thing that stands out with No is its form. It was shot on videotapes, U-matic to be precise, which, when paired with the film's costume and set design, makes the film feel like the 80s. It's not like we're watching a recreation of the 80s, but like we're watching an old documentary that was made at that time that's just now resurfaced. Lorraine further delineates reality from fiction by integrating old news footage, TV programs, and the like into the movie. The decision to shoot on videotape was pretty smart, as everything feels cohesive, but also it just looks cool. The film's story is a battle of the wits between two political campaigns, the campaign for yes and the campaign for no. The no campaign hires on an ad exec, Rene, played by Gil Garcia Bernal, to help them in their fight against Pinochet. Rene isn't as gung-ho about politics as some of the other people in the campaign, but he brings a much-needed new perspective to their strategy. He wants to sell no in a similar way to how he would sell a soda or a soap opera. He doesn't want to remind people of the oppressive past of the Pinochet regime. He wants to sell them happiness if they say no. After much infighting with his peers, Rene gets his way and airs his joyous no campaign to great success. What ensues is a kind of satirical back and forth between the yes and the no campaigns leading up to the referendum. No portrays the authoritarianism of Chile in the 80s and doesn't shy away from the brutality of it all, but Lorraine maintains a light touch, filling his film with a healthy dose of humor and optimism. It's a movie that covers themes of censorship, totalitarianism, consumerism, and in a way, it stands as a satire of modern society and modern politics by showing how running a political campaign and running an ad campaign for a soda are not quite as dissimilar as one might think. When you ask a Western cinephile what directors come to mind when they think of Soviet cinema, you can expect them to answer with people like Tarkovsky, Klimov, or Eisenstein. When you ask the same question to people in Eastern Europe, they're pretty likely to respond with Danilia. He was an extremely influential auteur in the Eastern Bloc, yet he remains relatively obscure in the West. His 1964 lyrical comedy, Walking the Streets of Moscow, is a great introduction to his work, and it is also one of the most accessible films in all of Soviet art cinema. It feels like a mix of a French New Wave film and an 80s American teen comedy. There isn't much of a story, as the film operates as a series of misadventures over the course of one day in Moscow. Kolya, who's a young metro worker, acts as our tour guide through Moscow and through a cross-section of Soviet society. Along the way, he befriends a Siberian writer, Volodya, and they are soon joined by Kolya's best friend, Sasha, who is set to be married that day and is seeking deferment from conscription into the Red Army. The trio of young men make an odyssey across Russia's largest city, seeing the sights and interacting with a slew of interesting characters, from a Japanese tourist to a cynical janitor who fancies himself a writer and highbrow literary critic. And, of course, love is in the air. Sasha fights with his girlfriend all day on the telephone, throwing the possibility of them even getting married into question. Kolya and Volodya invite a cute record store clerk, Alyona, to the wedding. Volodya instantly falls in love with her, but it's a doomed youthful romance, as Volodya is only in Moscow for the day and must return to Siberia that night. It's funny and heartfelt, and serves as a time capsule of a time and a place that most Westerners aren't privy to. Maybe it shows Muscovites to be happier than they were. Maybe there are some definite propagandistic elements to it. But for me, that doesn't take away from the fact that this is just an excellent feel-good movie. The happy moments in this film are elevated by an undercurrent of melancholy. Many of these characters lived through the Second World War, and most of them lost many of their loved ones. Danelia doesn't get sentimental about it though. Characters talk about family members they lost, but they still get on with their lives and make the most of their situations, doing their best to find happiness. You can watch this film legally and for free on YouTube. I'll leave a link to it in the description, so go check this film out. It's short and sweet, and the theme song of it is such an earworm. I find myself singing it for days every time I rewatch this movie.
Соленый тихий океан и тундру и тайгу.
For the last film in this video, I want to recommend Overlord. No, not the Nazi zombie movie that came out a few years ago. The 1975 film about the lead up to D-Day. Don't worry, I wouldn't be recommending this film to you if it was just your run-of-the-mill war movie. It's not. I can honestly say that Overlord is a very special movie. You see, it's a movie that weaves real archival footage with a narrative story, much like No, which I talked about earlier in the video. I'd say that almost half the film is archival footage, and even the director, Stuart Cooper, noted that it's a movie in which the historical footage is the main motivator of the film, rather than the fictional narrative he shot. But you might have a hard time guessing what's real and what's fiction. The cinematographer, John Alcott, who is Kubrick's cinematographer, having shot 2001, The Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, and The Shining, shot this movie in such a way that the narrative sequences visually match the archives. He shot the film in black and white with German lenses from the 30s. Cooper had access to the original nitrate negatives of the war footage as well, so he was able to make duplicates of the archival films for Overlord that weren't corroded or low-res or in bad condition. Actually, the archival stuff in this movie looks stellar. It's beautiful, mesmerizing, and often disturbing. On top of that, they shot the film in an abandoned military facility left over from World War II. And since the film was made in conjunction with the Imperial War Museum, the filmmakers had access to all the correct uniforms, props, etc. from the time, as well as a team of experts who knew how to properly implement them into the film. So all you history nerds will surely appreciate the attention to historical detail. But this film isn't just trying to be an historical record. It's a poetic movie about what war takes from us. We follow Tom, an almost 21-year-old boy, as he leaves his family to join the war effort. He goes through basic training. He gets whisked around everywhere in England while his government is trying to figure out what to do with his regiment. He meets a girl and falls in love. He trains for the D-Day invasion. And finally, he and his men storm the beaches. It's a simple story elevated by the editing and cinematography. It's edited in such a beautiful, lyrical way, interweaving narrative, dream sequences, fantasies, and real war footage into one film. Alcott's photography is, of course, beautiful. The film graces us with amazing shots, like this one in which Tom and his girl kiss on a landing craft. To give an example of the masterful nature of the visual language in this movie, let's look at a sequence near the beginning. The camera dollies through a church while a baby is baptized. Next, we see a young boy in a train. The train leaves the station, leaving Tom alone and stranded. His youth has left him forever. Overlord is a must-watch for anyone who loves great filmmaking. It's also barely 80 minutes long, so it's a quick watch, unlike some of the other movies in this video. It's 80 minutes of brilliance. You won't regret watching it. I hope that one or more of these films caught your attention. If one of these movies becomes a favorite film of yours, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram or really anywhere and let me know. That's why I do all of this. If you guys like this video, I might make more of them down the line. But until then, I've been the Kino Corner, and I will see you all in the next video.